And yet, what did we just see? We saw Senator Ernst introducing her legislation of which I'm a co-sponsor. Together, we're leading the fight to protect the right to birth control. And what happened? The Democrats objected. Why did they object? Understand why they objected. Because they want to use this as an issue in November to scare people, and they don't want to talk about their own radical record. Instead, they want to falsely claim somebody is coming to take contraception. That is deliberately false. And so when you see millions of dollars of TV ads paid for by Democrats, ask yourself one question. Why did the Democrats just block Senator Ernst and my legislation protecting the right to birth control? Because this is not about protecting this right. It is about politics for the Democrats hiding their own radical view. I wish we would come together. By the way, next week I predict the Democrats are going to do the same thing. I have legislation protecting in vitro fertilization, another incredible medical miracle that, again, to the best of my knowledge, all 100 senators support. Katie Britt and I together have introduced that legislation, and yet I fully expect next week the Democrats to do what they just did today, which is object to it because they're playing politics and they're unwilling to actually put in federal law a real and strong protection. I know it's campaign season, but it is unfortunate that Democrats are not willing to work together. Had they not uttered two words, I object, Senator Ernst's my legislation protecting the right to birth control would have passed out of this body. But Senate Democrats didn't want it to. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The senior senator from Louisiana.
I ask unanimous consent to ask that baby to come back into the spectators gallery. That was the sweetest noise we've heard in New York for quite some time. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the following interns in my office be granted floor privileges until June 7th, 2024, Ms. Allison Moore and Mr. Charlie Hayes.
Without objection.
Madam President, Senate Democrats are using their power in the majority to push an alarmist and false narrative that there is a problem accessing contraception. They proposed a bill which is more about a solution to find a problem. Today's vote is nothing more than scaring and misleading the American people. Here are the facts. Let me show this graph. There is no state or territory that bans access to birth control pill. We made this graph. Here you see all the states that ban birth control are in orange, and all the states that allow it are in green. And if you notice, every state is green. This is not an issue unless your candidate for president is running behind in the polls and there's a need to make people frightened to turn out on a false issue to hopefully improve poll numbers. But misleading and scaring voters seems to be, in their mind, the only way they can get that extra support. But don't be mistaken. The bill goes way beyond protecting access to the routine use of birth control pills or other contraceptives, and there are plenty of reasons why Republicans oppose this legislation. Here's what the bill actually does. It defines contraception so broadly that it likely also includes a right to a chemical abortion pill. It eviscerates conscience protections for healthcare providers, overriding the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA. In fact, if enacted, this would be the first time a law explicitly waived RFRA. Now, by the way, we are a pluralistic society. Some people are pro-life, some people are pro-choice, but we've tried to find peace on this issue. You don't find peace by eviscerating people's rights. The American people deserve accurate information on this policy's effects. We are fortunate to meet a woman who survived two abortion attempts this week. She testified in the Help Committee. And so as Democrats continue to push the chemical abortion pill on women, we may learn of more abortion survivors when at-home, unsupervised abortions fail and put mothers at risk. My proposal directs the CDC to include attempted abortions as a method of delivery and to collect data on abortion survivals. It would also direct the Department of Health and Human Services to refer abortion survivors to applicable federal programs for vulnerable and newborn children. If Democrats stand behind their abortion on demand stance, why would they not support this policy? Nevertheless, I suspect the other party will not be interested in considering my proposal as part of this bill or any other political show vote that's scheduled in the coming weeks. With that, I yield.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Madam President, today, every senator must take a stand. If you agree all Americans deserve access to contraception, then vote yes on the Right to Contraception Act. This bill simply says that if you want to access birth control, or if you're a health care provider wanting to prescribe birth control, the government has no right to interfere. This is not a show vote. It's a show us who you are vote. And the American people are watching. Up to 90% of Americans support access to contraceptives. But today, 1 in 5 adults are now worried that birth control is under threat. This is just one of the consequences of our overturning Roe. So we have every reason in the world to vote yes today. We should all agree that in America, nobody should ever question if their ability to access contraceptives will be taken away. Sadly, that's precisely the fear more and more people feel today. Passing this bill would put those fears to rest and protect people's basic civil liberties. So again, it's all very simple. If you agree all Americans deserve to have access to contraception, then you should support the bill. Thank you to Senators Markey, Hirono, and others for championing this legislation, and let us all vote yes. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call with respect to the cloture vote on the motion to proceed be waived.
Without objection.
I ask consent that the vote begin now.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 400 as 4381, a bill to protect an individual's ability to access contraceptives and so forth, signed by 17 senators.
Under the previous order, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S. 4381, a bill to protect an individual's ability to access contraceptives and to engage in contraception and to protect a healthcare provider's ability to provide contraception and information related to contraception shall be brought to a close. The yeas and the nays are mandatory under the rule, and the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Aye. Could I?
Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.